Horror films. They make us shiver, sweat, squirm. It's the cinematic genre that manages to trigger and revive our deepest fears and phobias. No other genre creates such an impact through the use of image and sound, bringing our nightmares to life.
It's alive! It's alive! He extended his arm, and he made me drink.
We always tell ourselves that it's silly to be afraid of something that is not real, something that is just meant to scare you. However, can it be real? What is it that we're actually afraid of?
So we can see horror cinema and horror culture on the one hand as reflecting society's anxieties or social fears, but I think there's also the argument that horror can also be a deeply personal experience.
In 1978, film critic Robin Wood came up with a theory that marked a crucial turning point in the intellectual discussions of horror. Robin Wood argues that the monster that often appears in horror films, even in the form of a werewolf, ghost or serial killer, is nothing else than the embodiment of certain desires that have been repressed at a subconscious level and that strive to come out. These desires are held back by the norms of a restrictive society, a society that tells us what to wear, how to behave, even what to think in certain situations.
Well, Robin Wood's argument in his very influential article about the return of the repressed is that the monsters in horror films and also other kinds of horror culture embody certain identities or certain groups of people who are marginalised within society, or certain aspects of ourselves which we don't want to have to deal with. So, for example, you get monsters which either embody ethnic minorities or embody femininity, embody ideas of working classness, or embody aspects of sexuality which exist outside of heteronormativity, such as homosexuality or lesbianism.
Robin Wood defines a horror film as a film with a monster, and his argument, which is basically a Freudian argument, is that the monster represents something that is repressed in our culture, so something that is forbidden or taboo.
So in every society there are certain things that we repress in order to be consistent with the norms of that society.
According to Wood, one of the strongest impulses that are repressed in a society are of a sexual nature. These impulses come to question the image of the ideal inhabitant.
We still live in a society where certain groups are repressed, but also certain ideas, certain kind of identities are repressed within the individual. So, for example, if you're a man, you're supposed to repress your femininity. If you're a sexual individual, you're supposed to repress your homosexuality in favour of heterosexuality. If you're, for example, if you're a white person, you're supposed to behave in a particular way and maybe repress identities or aspects which are associated with other cultures. So I think we live in a society which is both kind of oppressive and also repressive.
So Wood's argument is that all monsters really in horror films can be traced back to something that has been repressed. So it might be sex, it might be class. Sometimes monsters are represented as being kind of working class, like the killers in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, who are slaughterhouse workers. It might be connected to race. A film like Candyman would be an example where the monster in that film is he's a victim of racism, and he comes back as this sort of frightening, powerful African-American monster figure with a hook for a hand.
Be my victim. Be my victim. I am the writing on the wall, the whisper in the classroom. Without these things, I am nothing. So now I must shed innocent blood. Come with me.
One of my favourite examples of a kind of monstrous figure which can be associated with ideas of repression is the attack of the 50-foot woman, and the idea of this kind of monstrous female character is like this kind of huge destructive force. In some ways that kind of exemplifies what Wood's talking about when he talks about the return of the repressed as some kind of oppressed individual or oppressed group kind of wreaking destruction on society, and then at the end being destroyed. But we can also think about other kinds of monstrous characters. For example, the figure of the zombie can be thought of in terms of fear of kind of working class masses. I mean, zombies traditionally wear quite sort of shabby, dowdy clothes. They kind of shamble along. They're not terribly articulate. They kind of maybe embody various ideas to do with the kind of uneducated mass. The whole point of the zombie is that it's not something which is dangerous in and of itself on its own, but when a huge group of them get together, they can cause a lot of destruction and also can completely take over a society or a town.
As mindless creatures carry out his cursed will, terror explodes in horror and heartquake.
Zombie! Hanabi!
There were a few British horror films made a few years ago that some critics started referring to as hoodie horror, where they were sort of out of control youths. Films like Eden Lake that seemed to be playing on tabloid fears about working class youth out of control, the hoodie, the chav, this new kind of folk devil.
What is it in this process of oppression that terrifies us so greatly? Can cinema have such a powerful influence over its audience?
Here's the final touch.
In a way, you could argue that the films themselves are kind of telling us to be scared of certain things, to be scared of women, of other races, of anything that is other. These are the things, these are kind of located as the things that are scary.
Elizabeth!
Horror is a very interesting genre because on the one hand it's associated, going to a horror film is associated with being scared, being frightened, not necessarily very pleasant emotions, not emotions which we associate with being entertained, and yet people do pay to go to see horror films and be scared.
David Cronenberg, an American film critic, was talking about the nature of horror in terms of exploring the unconscious mind. He says, "For me, the imagery of the creature of the Black Lagoon was always perfect, because the Black Lagoon is the dark pool of the unconscious, and of course there are creatures within it. The exercise is to jump into the lagoon and see what's going on down there and say hello to the creature."
And one of the key ways, I think, in which horror works is that actually there's a pleasure in unleashing those things as well. And this is something Robin Wood talks about too, that the pleasure of horror is actually being able to unleash those things in a safe environment.
And quite often when we watch horror films we enjoy them, and we have a certain love-hate relationship with the monster. And according to Wood's argument, what we can see going on there is maybe a sense where that part of us which is being repressed we actually enjoy seeing it kind of coming out and wreaking havoc and destruction.
Will you come play with me?
A child is the embodiment of purity and innocence, but when put in a horror context, the image of the evil child is one of the most powerful cinema can create.
Children have this certain uncanniness about them because they look like people, but they're smaller, and they're, we don't really know what they're thinking. We can't talk to them in the same way as we talk to adults. There's something a little unsettling about children because they're the same as us adults, but they're also different. So maybe that's the reason why we find children unsettling and disturbing.
The echo of a child's laughter, the creaking of swings in a deserted playground, masked faces of clowns, they all invoke memories of our childhood we thought forgotten.
My mum used to have a massive array of porcelain dolls, and they used to be scattered all the way around the room. And I fell asleep once on the living room floor in my mum's house, and when I suffered from the next attack of sleep paralysis, these porcelain dolls were basically all over me, and one was sitting on my chest and she had hairy feet. I have no idea why she had hairy feet, because she was porcelain, but seriously, they were sort of sitting on me, pushing me down, and to me that was probably the start of when I started to be scared of things in general.
Childhood is something which we as adults have repressed. It's something which we're supposed to have left behind. We're supposed to reject the childishness within us, or the childlike aspects of ourselves, in order to become functioning adults. So, according to the repression thesis, childhood is another one of those qualities which we as adults have had to reject, which then returns in a monstrous form, in the form of monstrous children.
The family often becomes the place where horror begins. We have the monstrous family, or we have the family that turns on itself. And I think the monstrous child often is kind of located within that environment.
Red rum. Red rum. Red rum. Red rum.
Within a lot of horror films you can give examples of things like Children of the Corn, or The Midwich Cuckoos, or the Omen series. We can see, or The Exorcist is another kind of classic example of films where the child character is a monster. And yet at the same time we also have films where the children are some kind of vulnerable figure that is attacked by the monster, which is being preyed upon by the monster. In The Shining, for example, we have I think his name's Danny, the young boy who is, as viewers, we're supposed to feel protective towards and feel that he's a threat in some way. But then there are also the twins, the kind of monstrous twins who appear in that kind of classic moment, who seem to embody a very different idea of childhood, the idea of children as somehow threatening.
Come play with us, Daddy.
Freud uses the term uncanny to describe something which is kind of unsettling or disturbing, but it's very hard to put our finger on exactly what it is.
Forever and ever and ever.
One of the frightening things about The Monstrous Child is that we have certain taboos about defending ourselves. If children turn on us, we know we're not supposed to hurt children. How do we defend ourselves then? You know, if we suddenly discover that you know, our child is the Antichrist, as happens in The Omen.
Alleys and side streets are symbolically used in horror for scenes of entrapment, vulnerability and exposure, particularly for women. In a male-dominated culture, woman as the other assumes particular significance in horror cinema.
Female sexuality is bound up with Robin Wood's ideas around repression. Because of the forms of sexuality that are repressed, including homosexuality, child sexuality, female sexuality is another of those areas where horror often trades seemingly on anxieties about female sexuality.
There's a lot written about the Alien franchise and the way in which various gynecological imagery was used to kind of characterise the alien monster when it opens its mouth, and it's got those kind of like that mouth within the mouth with the dripping teeth. A lot of writers have argued that this represents the kind of vagina dentata, the anxiety, the masculine anxiety of the vagina with teeth. I think that the gender politics of horror films are very interesting because, of course, quite often within the horror film we have a central female character, the figure of the final girl who is the one who manages to succeed and manage to survive to the end of the movie, while all the male characters are killed. And we can see that in lots of different perspectives. On the one hand, we could, as various writers have argued, that we can see some horror films as kind of like having feminist characteristics because they have empowered female characters. At the same time, other writers have argued that the reason why the female is so central to the horror film is as a victim.
Well, I think one of the most famous critical accounts of women in the horror film would be Carol J. Clover's book Men, Women and Chainsaws, where she talks, for example, about really some of the most extreme controversial genres, the slasher film, the rape revenge film, which seem to both offer extreme images of victimhood, of women being terrorised and violated and raped and murdered, but on the other hand seemingly, you know, what can superficially seem, I'm hesitant to use the word empowering, but certainly, you know, women fighting back in the slasher film, although usually only one woman fighting back, it's usually just the one who survives. Sometimes, Carol J. Clover argues, it seems to project a kind of male subjectivity onto heroines. The figure known as the final girl in the slasher film who fights back and kills the killer, Clover argues almost becomes a kind of substitute boy at the end of the film. One of the ways in which it remains a controversial genre and remains a genre that feminists write about a great deal, feminists remain interested in. And even within feminist critiques of horror, there are very different points of view, between points of view which identify, you know, understandably identify examples of misogyny in the horror genre, and those writers who find maybe a more complex, ambivalent set of images.
Rats. Thousands. Millions of them.
But no, this is no dream. This is Dracula, the original terrifying story of a maniac and a man who lived after death, lived on human blood, took the form of a vampire bat, and lured innocent girls to a fate truly worse than death.
As time passes and society evolves, horror cinema must adapt to current fears and anxiety to remain impactful.
Well, what tends to happen over time is that the monster becomes familiar to us, the monster in the horror film. And this might be why horror films lose their power over time.
No matter the period, horror has always been a way of reflecting the fears of society. The film is a reflection of ourselves, managing to release a darker side of us, a side of us we wouldn't think could exist, yet sure enough it surfaces. It scares us, and what's more frightening, it draws us like a magnet, making us enjoy it.